My name is Phil Weiser. I am the Dean at the University of Colorado Law School. I'm also the partner with William Boyd in our Energy Innovation series. This event is sponsored by RACI, and we have a number of supporters from the community who are helping to make this possible. When we think about issues that are fundamental to our country, energy has to be at the top of anyone's list. They're getting increasing attention. They're not easy. And having a forum where people can come together who are in the policy world, we're going to have a wonderful keynote cleanup hitter and Tony Clark, the commissioner on the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We have a lot of great folks joining us today from practice, academia, and of course a number of students here who are looking at this area. So this is a delightful set of conversations. I look forward to facilitating the last one. I want to turn it over to my partner and just say what an amazing asset he is for the law school and the community. Let's give a round of applause to William Boyd.
Thanks, Phil, and thank you for your support for all that we're doing here on energy, environment, and natural resources at the law school. I want to thank all of you for coming this afternoon. This is our third Energy Innovation event this semester, and it's part of a series that we've been co-sponsoring with the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute, or RACI, as part of their Big Energy series, and I want to thank Mike Notek and RACI for their support. Mike will be here later. I don't see him yet, but I know he's coming over later. I want to say a couple of things by way of introduction, and then I'll turn it over to the first panel. Generalizations about the massive multi-trillion-dollar energy system obviously do not come easy. Earlier today, Mark Safdie, who some of you know, he's the head of the Energy and Infrastructure Practice Group at Holland and Hart, and he's teaching a renewable energy project finance class here at the law school as an adjunct this semester, and we're very happy to have him, very fortunate to have him doing that. He described the current situation at a lunch today as a, quote, completely beautiful exotic state of utter chaos. Mike Notek, who's the head of RACI, says the whole thing is giving him gray hair, and he really doesn't have a lot of room to maneuver on the gray hair front. So it's a complicated, rapidly changing situation out there. I think one thing that we can all agree on is that we are in the midst of rapid change across many dimensions and multiple levels, without a real clear idea of where things are headed. The energy world today is not the world that we expected to be living in just a few years ago. We're clearly in the middle of dramatic, some would say unprecedented, even revolutionary changes in the energy supply picture, most notably the huge increase in unconventional gas and oil made possible by the combination of hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, what some have called the most important energy innovation of the last century. The shale gas boom, which we'll be talking about later today on the second panel, has significant implications for the electric power sector, for coal, for nuclear, for renewables, for land use, for local communities, for manufacturing, for the geopolitics of energy, for climate change. And we'll spend some time talking about that, as I said, on the second panel. At the same time, we're seeing significant changes in market structure and business models across the energy sector, in financing and contractual arrangements, in regulatory models and approaches, and we'll address some of those issues on our first panel with Ray Gifford and others. And we're seeing a number of changes in and new demands on our energy infrastructure, challenges of adapting and upgrading our transmission grid, the rise of distributed generation, the ability to aggregate demand response and bid it into wholesale power markets, smart grids, advances in storage. Those are some of the issues we'll talk about in the third panel. So we're going to explore a number of these different issues this afternoon in three panels. Ray Gifford will kick things off with a panel on market structure and contractual arrangements. I'll then moderate a panel on implications of the shale gas boom, and Phil Weiser will be back to finish with a panel on transmission, distributed generation, and storage. And we'll then have a keynote by FERC Commissioner and former North Dakota PUC Commissioner Tony Clark. We're very fortunate to have him here today, and I want to thank him and all of the panelists for joining us today. Finally, I want to remind everyone of our final Energy Innovation event of the semester. It's another half-day conference. It will be in this room on the afternoon of Friday, November 9th. It's on financing energy innovation. We've got a great lineup to discuss a number of the challenges and the opportunities regarding energy innovation finance. So I hope to see some of you here for that. With that, I think I'll turn it over to Ray and his panel. We'll march through the first two panels. Each panel will last about an hour. There should be time for Q&A during the panels. Then we'll take a break and we'll come back to the third panel in the keynote.
Thanks, Willie.
Yep.
We do.
You're going to introduce the panel.
I am, very quickly, yes. Good afternoon, and it's great to be moderating a panel at Silicon Flatirons where we're not talking about telecom. My name is Ray Gifford. I am a senior adjunct fellow here at Silicon Flatirons and partner at Wilkinson Barker & Nauer in Denver. This panel to kick off the session today is going to be talking about market structure and contractual arrangements in the energy field and the changes that might bring about. We have a great group of folks to discuss that. Starting immediately to my left is Colorado PUC Chairman Joshua Appel. Joshua is currently the chairman of the Public Utilities Commission in Colorado. Before that, had a legal career in the midstream gas market and was also chairman of the Colorado Oil and Gas Commission. Next to Chairman Appel is Diana Moss, who's Vice President of the American Antitrust Institute. Diana and I have worked together on a couple matters. And Diana started or spent a part of her career at FERC, so she certainly knows her energy markets and the issues surrounding that. And last but not least is Carl Steen, who's a partner at Fulbright and Jaworski in its LA office. He has a background in energy project finance, and he's going to tell us how the California energy market can be made to work. Oh, I'm sorry.
In a 1 hour panel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me start with you, Diana. The past decade, we've seen a lot of experiments in the states on a regional basis with RTOs and ISOs. Those different models going from complete disintegration of the traditional utility model, as you'd probably see in Texas, to various partial disintegrations of the utility market, to remaining, like we are here in Colorado, fully vertically integrated here in large parts of the Mountain West and large parts of the Southeast. In that past decade where we've had a California energy crisis, we've had kind of a massive wave of bankruptcies of independent power production. What, if anything, have we learned from these various experiments, and what do you think that means going forward for the structure of U.S., particularly electricity markets, is what I'm thinking about here?
Okay. Can everyone hear me? I guess this picks up from...
I think it picks up pretty well.
Okay, great. So that's sort of $1 million look-back question. When I was in FERC, at FERC in the late 1990s, I probably 60-some-odd mergers probably came across my desk, where we were really looking at the fallout from open access, from various deregulatory initiatives in the industry, and that's the first thing you'd expect is a kind of a big shakeup. And how the industry organized itself and how these markets began to develop in different regions. I think FERC was on a roll back then with the RTO order and following on the heels of open access, and really got excited about these markets and the development of these centralized, organized markets as opposed to these decentralized markets that operate primarily on a bilateral trading basis. And so there was this standard market design initiative, which I think fell very flat. And I think this far out, looking back, that was a good thing. It was a good thing that standard market design didn't work out. It was politically unpalatable. And I think the reason is that we have learned so much in that time about electricity markets and how they've developed across the United States. And we've learned a few things. One is that regional geography, regional markets matter a lot. We have tremendously different fuel sources from region to region. We have different transmission issues from region to region. There are so many economic factors that go into how these markets are characterized that we really have to look at it on a regional basis. So a one-size-fits-all doesn't work in the United States or any other large geographic area where you do have subregions. That's number one. Number two is business models are evolving over time. You know, we certainly do have the integrated regulated utility model. We're now seeing a lot of spinning off of transmission. Entergy wants to sell all of its transmission to ITC. That's an up-and-coming matter. So utilities are experimenting based on their experience in markets and incentives that they face for investment. And what makes sense for them in terms of business models with different formulations. And I think that's going to continue to evolve over time. So business organization is very much in play, and I think is an evolving sort of animal. And then third, the market power issues are key. I obviously work for the American Antitrust Institute. We're very much advocates for competition policy. But what we've learned a lot about in the last 10 or 15 years is how conducive markets are to the exercise of market power, whether it's unilateral exercise, you know, withholding generation to drive up prices, or not building transmission capacity to constrain the grid and drive up prices, or whether it's coordinated interaction like we saw with Keyspan and Morgan Stanley and in the New York ISO. Market power issues are huge in the industry, and we have, I think, only begun to grapple with them through this very difficult interface between regulation and antitrust. So I think we still have a lot to learn, and it's probably too soon to be stamping the industry with any sort of one-size-fits-all.
Carl, let me go to you with your background in project finance and watching where the capital wants to go and where it doesn't want to go, which is usually a pretty good indicator of maybe where the future is going to be. Let me ask the basic question. Where in the U.S. does capital want to go? What does it want to avoid? And how have capital markets, and in your practice, have you seen the various changes to the market dynamics across the country ebb and flow toward this is where people want to invest and this is where they don't?
Right, right. Well, I think probably from the very beginning, as one would expect, capital wants to flow where there is certainty, and where there is too much risk, whether it's risk in terms of the particular purchaser, the revenue stream, risk in terms of the regulatory environment, risk in terms of the federal or state tax policy or other policies. Capital will not, will have a distaste for that, and you'll see, higher interest rates or higher rates in terms of the ability to raise capital. But in a nutshell, it's really where you have and some of this gets into a question of contract term and structure, but banks and equity investors need certainty. And if you have, for example, production tax credit that is uncertain, or in this case, going back a few years, it was uncertain, or you have, let's say, take the example of a geothermal project. Geothermal project takes a lot longer to develop than a wind project or a solar project. So let's say you have a 4-year development horizon, and you're not sure what the tax credit situation is going to be. You're just not going to get a lot of money flowing into geothermal projects. It makes it quite a bit harder. So some of those decisions in that regulatory framework will greatly affect whether money will come into certain regions and certain states.
Joshua, your job as a regulator is to both give that certainty but also protect ratepayers, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, Diana's market power concerns are really what regulation was put in place to stop. How do you, at a very high level, balance that need for certainty that capital markets want with the interests of ratepayers? And let's add the next layer, which is the title of this conference. How do you invite or create incentives for innovation to enter into this mix, given most of our regulatory tools really don't focus on innovation at all?
Well, Ray, At this point, I also have to put on my bland regulator face, and both you and former Chairman Sopkin could give the caveat that what I'm saying is my own views and not those of the Commission, but also, as many people know in this room, next week we start our electric resource plan. 2 weeks of hearings which deal precisely with one of the issues you raised, which is that balance of innovation and stability. One of the nice things about being in Colorado is, so far I've not seen the real tension between the ratepayers and making sure that, as Carl said, we have that certainty for the utility. And in fact, I'll commend your public service company. They recently entered into a settlement agreement with a number of the parties in here, which is a 3-year settlement with keeping rates at a very low rate. So I haven't seen that complexity. One of the nice things about Colorado, besides the fact we're very clean politics, is we have a good cooperative spirit. So I'm not sure I can address that tension. Innovation is probably the greatest challenge, but to me is one of the focuses I keep on is we always have to be talking about modernization. And sometimes people talk about innovation, which is there's a low-hanging fruit or there's something great out there, which I think is not really, certainly my perspective. I think it's all about incrementalism and saying what's the next level of improvement? Can we get greater efficiencies? And rewarding that type of behavior.
Diana, do you see any institutional responses to the innovation question? I mean, the one thing that markets tolerate innovative failure. You lose, right? Too bad, so sad. Regulation doesn't really have a great means to create the upside incentives you want for innovation, nor the downside incentives. So are there any intermediate regulatory responses or institutional regulatory responses you can think of that would give players in this industry the incentive to innovate, and or is that just not the regulatory model we have?
Well, I think there are probably a few people in the room who would claim that a regulated natural monopoly produces huge incentives to innovate. I think that's been disproven empirically in the economics literature, and certainly there's been a huge legal literature that's sprung up around this concept. I think there's two issues here. One is where are the incentives to innovate going to come from? Are they going to come from the state, from governments through energy efficiency mandates, for example, renewable portfolio standards? So are we going to graft on the industry a set of requirements and even go further and instruct the industry in how they will meet those requirements and what types of business models will evolve to meet those requirements in the most efficient way? Or are we going to let the private sector handle the innovation? And I think it's arguably the case that the private sector is probably the best at handling innovation. So on the basis of that sort of bifurcation in where the innovation is going to be stimulated, I think what we're seeing is that the industry itself is slowly but surely making these decisions by changing the business model. Yes, we will continue to have these sort of utility service companies that are fully regulated and vertically integrated. They will continue to provide, a high quality, reliable service to consumers at regulated rates, perhaps going into wholesale markets, competitive markets to bid for supplies. But other utilities are going to be spinning off parts of the business that are really the major constraints to innovation. So if we see smart grid integrators, for example, developing, or grid operators developing, they will have every incentive to invest in the most efficient transmission technologies and upgrades and modifications that there are.
But doesn't that take a different market structure than the vertically integrated structure?
Yes, it absolutely does. And I think the answer to your question, which is sort of the middle ground, how can institutions help here, is that if you're going to morph from the vertically integrated structure to the de-integrated structure, you have to give utilities, or whatever you want to call them, energy companies, utilities, because this is all in flux right now, you have to give them incentives to do that. And the starting place, I think, is decoupling sales from revenue. It's the whole decoupling issue that we've talked about. There's a hand in the audience. Where utilities actually have incentives to invest in energy efficiency because they'll make money doing it. Right now they don't make money doing it, and so they have no incentive to do it. So institutions have to sort of jumpstart this process by changing the regulatory model. But at the same time, regulators are going to have to work closely with antitrust enforcement. Think of them as complements, not substitutes, so that as these markets develop and we have perhaps de-integrated utilities in some areas and integrated utilities in others, where intellectual property issues now become more important because of smart grid technologies and this sort of thing, we're going to see a whole bunch of competitive issues pop up that the regulatory domain doesn't deal very well with. So we're going to see more antitrust and regulation interface, hopefully more cooperation, more working together to work through these problems.
Considering this is an academic discussion, we always want some controversy here, and I have to be careful generalizing from the experience in Colorado because we really are an island compared to California or a number of the other regions. But if you look what's happened in Colorado over the last few years, starting with the renewable portfolio standard, which is created by the voters, and we have Senator Gail Schwartz here, who was also a champion of this. That really led to innovation and compelled public service company to be a national leader both on wind and solar. And then we had recently the Clean Air, Clean Jobs Act, which preceded me, but it also set out with a cooperative structure from the state government. Quite frankly, one of the large motivators was the natural gas industry is such a glut here that they were finally able and willing to sign long-term contracts. But that has created a huge innovation. So I think when you take the right type of cooperative approach, which is difficult, in a state as fractious as California, which I would never touch one of those jobs in California, there are ways to have innovation with a cooperative approach between state government, the affected utility, and other players.
But let me push back on that a little bit, though, and also bring Carl into the discussion, because Diana mentioned about this a little bit, too. There is one attempted innovation, there's one model for innovation, and it may be the best one we have in a vertically integrated state, which is you, either through the voters or through a legislative plan, go say, utility, go do this. And whatever we think is the innovative solution. The problem with that model, the mandate model, is if the innovation fails, the ratepayers hold the bag, right? If the production tax credit goes away and we have too much expensive wind, or if something goes wrong with that mandate and you mess it up, the entity who holds the bag is not like in a market, and I'm not saying that we have the ability to make a market, not like in a market risk capital, it's unrisked ratepayers. So that innovation vector, if you will, is slightly presumptuous, isn't it?
Perhaps, but then you look at the alternative experience, then I'll give it to Carl. You look at the experience in California or the experience in Texas. I'd much rather be a ratepayer in Colorado or Wyoming or us Intermountain West states than the grand innovators.
Right. Well, so I will speak to California. I don't feel responsible for the entire state and all its policies.
We're going to attribute everything having to do with California.
But I have lived there long enough to, and prior to the deregulation, I guess we could call it a fiasco or experiment, grand experiment, whatever term you'd like to put on it. But it is a state where there's been quite a bit of innovation and experimentation. And what I see more is kind of there's a circle here, because what happens is you have innovation, and I'll get to the mandate issue in a second, but whether that comes from the private sector or it's driven by legislation, going all the way back to PURPA, you create certain products that are different from how business had been done in the past. When you create those products, that has some additional consequences. That needs regulators in a market that understands those products. That in turn, leads to the kind of next wave of regulation and then more products. California has quite, at this stage, I mean, I guess to answer the chairman, if you lived in LADWP's service territory during even the deregulation crisis, you had no impact on your rates because they were not impacted on that. If you lived in the southern part of Edison's service territory, you had massive rate impact. So what happened there was you had a mandate or a deal that was cut with the utilities, get rid of all the generation, and now you can, now there are certain parts of that bargain in terms of rates and other things that you would like to do. But what the discovery was that was an imbalanced approach in the end. I mean, to the point where when Nevada was following on the heels of California and trying to do the same thing, the governor had to put the brakes on it in the middle of it, and they just basically outlawed the divesting of generation. So I think that some of the innovation and the flexibility does have to come from the regulators and certainly from the legislators. And I think what's healthy is, for example, your own experience, Chairman, where someone comes from private practice or understands those concepts and then is sitting in the chair of the regulator and has to make those decisions. But I think it has to be a balanced approach. I think you have to, California became quite unbalanced. I remember doing transactions where, if you go all the way back, for example, prior to PURPA in 1978, where you had the completely vertically integrated model, you had most of the time spent in hearings about what the utility did, whether it was right or wrong, the rate increases, the look-backs, all that stuff. A lot of that based on the nuclear industry, by the way. But once you created a model where utilities had to purchase, and you created that mandate, and you didn't really put in place incentives, this is to your point, Diana, you created a different, you skewed it and created a different set of issues. Now you had a lot of litigation over every single term inside a power purchase agreement and every other issue about competition and whether there should be bidding and not. So you create in turn a lot of different issues.
Well, let me take from what you just said, Carl, and make the case that in the last 40 to 50 years, regulation has induced massive waves of malinvestment that should concern us greatly. And we may not be able to solve it, but we may want to approach it with fear and trembling. So we start with the nuclear bubble in the 70s, where we threw enormous sums of capital into the ground for a resource that, unless you own it today, was a white elephant. Then PURPA, which you mentioned, which created rights for independent generation to interconnect and sell at an avoided cost rate to the vertically integrated utilities at the time. But we got massive PURPA overbuilds, and you can certainly trace the 20 years later restructuring political momentum to states with a lot of PURPA QFs. So you got the nuclear bubble, you've got the PURPA bubble. Let me offer the IPP bubble, which came in the late 90s and burst in the early 2000s when every generator and utility in the world created a subsidiary that went out and built these merchant plants. That right now you can, the last 5 years you've been buying for a song. So there's the third wave of malinvestment. Right now, certainly, if you listen to the wind supporters, if PTC goes away, you're going to have a renewable bubble pop. That doesn't sound to me like a system that creates the certainty that you pointed out at the beginning, Carl, or the solidity that ratepayers want, Mr. Chairman Appel. So what do we do with this? We have a recent history where regulation has driven malinvestment, not prudent investment. Diana?
Well, that's all true, and part of it is just an artifact of how we add capacity in the industry. I mean, capacity additions are lumpy because of economies of scale and scope in some cases, and economies of coordination between generation and transmission and distribution. So part of it is just a pure artifact of the economics. But the industry having been burned so many times with the nuclear, the IPP, and even to some extent the natural gas bubble, all this gas-fired capacity came online, and then all the gas price forecasts were revised in a disfavorable way. So that hasn't really happened in terms of creating a bubble, but there was enough concern surrounding maybe having too much gas-fired capacity around. And I think the way the industry responds or can respond is it's been slow. It's a very sort of glacially moving kind of evolution, but one is to think about smaller modular forms of generation. Distributed generation, I mean, if you want to go to the extreme on the demand side, where users on the system can really take most of the control over the size of the addition, how they use it, how they can control it. Of course, the big issue there will be how the utility works with distributed generation and potentially reverts to...
And just to clarify, distributed generation, what are you talking about?
Dealing, small cogen facilities, small wind, photovoltaics, that the customer on the demand side can really install with the blessing of the utility and potentially serve a lot of their own demand, but nonetheless is integrated ideally via smart grid technology with the grid in a way that allows the utility to better manage the grid and increase reliability and that sort of thing. So these are smaller increments of capacity. But that whole model requires a very decentralized control system, which utilities don't like. Utilities like central dispatch and lots of control over what's on their system for obvious reasons. It also will mean that we'll have to come up with a whole new set of standards to prevent discrimination against demand-side resources, much like we've been grappling with on the supply side for years and years now. So I think that's one way to sort of cure this problem. The other avenue that's fruitful is again back to this business model where utilities are going to morph and transform themselves, or new entrants will come into the market, offering products and services that really are less immune, or more immune rather, to sort of the lumpy investment gotcha game, where they are able to manage risk, technology risk, regulatory risk, market risk, all these different forms of risk that Carl's talking about over here, in ways that they can improve their revenue forecasts and be more attractive to investors and that sort of thing. So that's going to come out of the morphing model.
Ray,
Carl, I was going to
I
ask.
want to clarify it a little bit, because I think sometimes there's a tendency to look back and say, okay, well, the IPP bubble or this fiasco or that fiasco, all of these were innovations to the market that created a lot of benefits, a lot of efficiencies, a great broadening of the number of players in the market.
But let me put my consumer advocate's hat. Who held the bag for those failures? And more often than not, it was ratepayers.
Right.
IPP bubble, we maybe be different.
But if you have no competitive forces, let's say that you just go back to a cost-plus model, you have a higher equity content, so therefore you're having more expensive money. The levered model is less expensive. That's really what gave rise to project finance. So you have a more expensive model for building plants, more expensive capital, and you have very little competitive forces, none in the pure model, to check the costs. So if you go all the way back to the 70s, or when a lot of these plants that are now quite old were built, you had massive cost overruns. And who is saddled with the nickel in that situation? Well, maybe it's the utility if they lose the rate case or they don't get what they wanted, but by and large that was also the consumers. So I think the answer is more of a balance. I think what Diane is suggesting, there should be a component for distributed generation. It makes sense. If you can localize or put the power source near the load, you don't have a lot of transmission issues. You don't need a 500 megawatt PV facility that you then have to build a transmission line to get it to the load. I'm sorry, you were going to...
No, I think that's right. Joshua, the regulator's dilemma you have here in a vertically integrated state is you can't find a large enough squadron of regulators to go watch the utility closely enough to know what they're saying is true or not, right? It's the information asymmetry problem, which is real and permanent. But how do you even start thinking about avoiding those big regulatory errors, inflating a new bubble, whatever it may be, yet giving some of these new, and I think very exciting things that can happen around the edges with distributed generation, demand response, I think is very ripe. How do you create that space within a model, a vertically integrated model, that right now isn't really into that stuff?
I think you have to be very cautious. It's just like all of us, we aspire to having a balanced portfolio in our investments. We don't want to go heavily one way or the other. Perhaps the bubble I'm most concerned about, and it's one of my previous industries, is the natural gas bubble. I mean, everybody's dashing to gas, over-relying without saying, how is this balanced out? And to me, it's keeping track of the fundamentals, saying, how much gas can we go forward? How much distributed generation? But at the same time, we have to make sure we don't dash off to say distributed generation is the panacea.
Right.
And we have to approach it carefully
Exactly.
and looking at it really incrementally, saying, what is the next step? The one thing I don't like is faddism. And we see a lot of that. You can read the publications. 6 months ago, there was an industry, and I won't go through any one of the litanies, which is the next great thing, and you don't hear about it again. So I think doing what we call in the private sector your fundamental blocking and tackling. What is that next incremental step? What is the role for distributed generation versus acquiring a larger resource? As long as we don't, we make sure we're not going to say, well, everybody loves the new modular nuclear power plants. Let's build one of those. Well, I don't foresee that happening in Colorado. And so that's sort of, to me, it's working, saying, what's the next small incremental step towards getting as balanced a portfolio as we can? Because gas right now is just, it's a wonder for the entire country. I mean, we all are benefiting from lower rates, but an over-reliance on it, that's one that could come back and haunt us.
Right.
And I think we really have to be careful.
Especially, if I might, previously, and let's say Colorado has a number of coal plants, baseload plants. So California has a few left, but has very few coal plants that are still in existence, and most of those are being converted or repowered. So nuke is really the baseload. But when you use natural gas for baseload, or and you're trying to use combined cycle facilities to bridge the gap, so you've got a mix in the generation portfolio. You have some very healthy things that happen because of the RPS and similar policies. For a while in Colorado, you had wind projects, considering they did have PTC, but you had wind projects ahead of the bidding, ahead of the forward price curve.
Right.
That's a very beneficial result of good policies, and solar prices coming down. But now, in particular in this state, you've got a lot of these old coal plants that are baseload, and you've got a lot of the intermittent power. And in the middle, filling a larger and larger chunk of this is the natural gas. And right now, everybody's, as you say, it's the happy days, and natural gas forward pricing is flat. But anyone who's studied economics knows that can't remain forever. So we are looking at a situation of a potential bubble there, as well as an opportunity and a need. And the need is to somehow develop the flexibility to meet that middle ground and figure out how are you going to supply baseload. And right now in California, we have Songs down, San Onofre, the nuclear plant. That's a very large chunk of baseload generation that is not going to be available next summer. And everyone is scrambling to figure out how that's going to be met, especially if it's down for longer than that. And you need a balanced mix, or you're not going to be able to supply that without a huge price spike like we've had in the past.
Diana, Joshua mentioned fads and bewaring fads, which it is amazing to me that an industry that supposedly has stayed as energy is so subject to fads, and they come back. It's kind of like the width of ties. Is smart grid a fad that has faded?
Well, I was going to raise my hand and add on to what Carl was saying. I'm not sure it's a fad, but we're not seeing the rollout, the smart grid rollout that we thought we would see even 2 years ago. And maybe the industry is so staid and glacially moving that it needs these events or these episodes of faddism to sort of liven things up. But smart grid is, I would say, the latest, a good example of a very rosy future. We're going to decentralize the grid. Utilities are going to get out of the transmission business, and they're going to spin it off, and we're going to have electricity service companies jumping in to provide services for consumers. And by the way, let's just all remember that the consumer in the picture here is not a sophisticated consumer. This is where behavioral economics comes in a really, really big way. Consumers in electricity really don't want to choose their power suppliers. They don't absorb information well. They don't process information well. They are generally uninformed, despite utility efforts to inform them. We're really dealing with a very unsophisticated, very simple consumer that almost wants the delivered package, the delivered product, to the home. And I don't think that's going to change. I don't fundamentally think we're going to change the way consumers view electricity or other energy services as a product. It's very different in other industries where consumers are way more on the ball than they are in electricity. So you have this really sort of dead consumer element going on here, and then all this action, up the supply chain with innovation, regulatory models, business models, market power issues, market structure issues, the whole bit. So I think smart grid sort of has fallen victim to this, in part because of this sort of this faddism concept where we roll out a new idea, we're going to change a lot of stuff, fundamentally alter how the industry delivers services, but it's going to require all these regulatory changes, a lot of changes in incentives for utilities, at least traditional utilities, in terms of decoupling, which is a very political issue in some cases. Certainly, getting stuff financed is going to be problematic because of risks and that sort of thing. But in smart grid, in particular, the whole thing is bogged down in how to deal with these smart grid technology standards. NIST is involved, DOE is involved. There are more standard-setting bodies involved in this smart grid thing than you can shake a stick at.
If I might break in, but I think what the chairman had in that point here, which is that there's not a panacea.
Right.
And so when you treat it as though it's the next greatest thing
Right.
that's going to solve everything, there are some unintended consequences. And in smart grid, even one of them is now you have a different model and a different system and a different relationship of information flow between utility and customer, whether it's a security issue or otherwise. It's a whole different model. And to your point, you have a consumer that I guess I would say they, in the back of their minds, they view it as a fundamental service and are kind of looking at the bottom line. How much is it per month? I would say very few people study their utility bill. I did, and someone might call me a dork for doing that, but you look at the different levels of service, very few people are aware of that. They might be aware of it if their bill jumps up to $200 a month. So, yeah.
I just got back from Israel a couple days ago, so hopefully I'm not wavering as I'm sitting here since it's been less than 48 hours. But one of the most interesting innovations I've ever seen, exactly what you're talking about, Diana, was in Tel Aviv, there's a large power plant with a large smokestack, which you can see everywhere in town. From the back you can't see because it's facing the sea. But they have on the smokestack colors. And if it's green, it means there's not a lot of demand and your rate is okay. As my nephews and nieces told me, the minute we see it go red, which you can see from all over town, we cut back on our electricity. Because that is immediate, the rates have just gone up dramatically, and do you want to pay the consequences? It was probably one of the most effective consumer education tools I've ever seen. It's got to be a 150-foot stack with a large color right down the middle of it.
Right.
Well, how much of a culprit is our historic and very sound legacy of average cost pricing? I mean, I know there are some inverted block rates in certain places, but of course the problem with block rates is I don't know when I hit it, right? You know, it's not like there is a little stack in the middle of my house that says I just entered the next rate. How much of this is the retail pricing model, and how do we get consumers to engage with their energy usage differently, or do we? Anybody?
Oh, I mean, as a card-carrying economist, I have to come out strongly for the benefits of time-of-use pricing. And I think...
If you didn't do it, we
I
have to revoke
they
your card.
take away my PhD. But definitely there have been huge efficiency gains associated with moving consumers off a standard rate for the obvious reasons that it encourages overconsumption at certain times and underconsumption at other times. So huge efficiencies can be squeaked out of this system by altering prices to more, to tailor them more to periods of demand. So I think that goes without saying. You give consumers a smart meter, you give them the ability to respond to a signal. This is fascinating. We should try that in the United States, you know, the big smokestack with the green and red light. Just as a signaling device for consumers. So I think it goes without saying that is the gains there are huge. I think where we're seeing the friction or the resistance is in grafting or coming up with these new models like smart grid that are so fundamentally out of sync with how the industry is structured right now, and out of sync in terms of business model, but also out of sync with utility incentives. You know, we've spent 15 years grappling with open access on the supply side so that utilities don't bump competing generators off their grid. And we're barely out of that mess, and we're still in the mess, by the way, because those incentives remain, and people are working around, they're working behind the scenes to continue to discriminate. Now we're saying, okay, well, how are we going to prevent utilities from discriminating against demand-side resources? Well, think about that problem. That's a really hard problem to fix.
Well, and one of the ways we did it, and I always hearken back to some applicable lessons from telecom, is we went to price cap regulation.
Right.
Price cap regulation should, not saying it will, but if you look at the experience in Canada and the UK, the utility does become indifferent to supply or demand side resources. It should be indifferent to smart grid investments that's prudent. I mean, you know, part of our smart grid problem was when the administration in particular became very enthusiastic, the economy fell off the cliff, so the proposition to a utility was, hey, let's go take and invest a bunch of capital to make you more efficient when you're already long on generation. I mean, that's just not an attractive business proposition. So is performance-based regulatory plans, which are very rare in the US and not rare elsewhere in the world, something that we do need to look at to maybe not be the perfect silver bullet, but part of the solution here.
Yeah.
And decoupling is really, I think, a version
Yeah.
of price caps.
Yeah. I think we have to. You know, if we want to let the private sector take most of the control of innovation, and you know, the private sector wants to innovate. If there's money to be made and gains to be had in different ways, the private sector will respond. But we have to give them ways to see those types of incentives and respond to them. So flexible regulatory approaches, performance-based regulation, decoupling rates, decoupling sales from revenues. I mean, these are all good ways to try to loosen up the system in a way that gives utilities more incentives to to play the innovation game in an efficient way. You know, my concern as a competition advocate is, of course, a utility that you can work on that until the cows come home, but you will still have to grapple with this set of bad incentives, potentially bad incentives, to foreclose competitors from access to transmission, to foreclose.
But that's not a problem in Colorado because we don't have any transmission. We solve it that way. Let me make an observation, and Carl and Joshua get you to maybe respond. When I talk to kind of innovative startup companies in this space, of which there's a great small ecosystem around Boulder, around that, but other startups in the demand response space, in the DG space, My general impression whenever I talk to them is they say the place we want to go do business is Texas. Because Texas, no one can tell us no. And if we succeed in the most disintegrated market in the country. And I say this as a native Coloradan who's as bigoted against Texas as anyone can be. So is the Texas market structure the right one for innovation at the edge? Or not?
Well, I think, Texas is a unique market structure. It's unique in a lot of ways. You still have retail electric competition in Texas. And even though that experiment, failed miserably in California and other places, you still have it there. So it is a looser, wide open, landscape for that type of an approach. But I still think it's not. I think there are other places, Colorado, California, where the attractiveness of the market is still there. And Texas obviously has relatively good load growth and good economic growth going, but I think it's more of a crazy pattern there, and there's more winners and losers in that than there is a broader, more fertile environment for that type of innovation.
Let me comment on Texas, because Texas is so unique. Texas has, 8 or 9 times the population of Colorado. I believe their load is somewhere around 100,000 megawatts. They have industrial operations, which their refineries alone probably dwarf the demand of Colorado. So they're hard to emulate. They're so unique. I think when we're looking at innovation, and having come from the private sector before becoming an economic regulator, I think the remarkable innovative energies, particularly here in Boulder, but also Fort Collins, is people have to be more realistic in the market they're going to approach. When you look at the commercial sector, that is a lucrative or a wide open market with tremendous amounts of innovation. I think there's been a lot of focus on residential. Well, do you pick up a number of good customers, or do you go after lots of diffuse ones, which are harder to serve? And I think one of the things we've been addressing in Colorado, in fact, again, Senator Schwartz, forgive me for putting the attention on you, is Colorado did something unique with community solar gardens. Really harnessing the ability for solar to focus on aggregating demand for larger sources. I think that's a wonderful opportunity. And that's, when I look at innovation, I think people, going back to faddism, they want to jump on everything versus, I'm less concerned with industrial customers, because industrial customers, that's their fundamental business, to pay attention to a cost they don't have control over. They're going to manage their own costs. But that commercial sector, I think, and with community solar gardens, that's really where the opportunities are for innovation. But people are really focused on residential. That's a tougher nut to crack and make a living on.
The one thing about things like solar gardens and so forth, though, is you start to really stress the non-discrimination norms that really undergird a lot of public utility law. Mm-hmm. And those norms have served us well, but they came from a different time. Does the price discrimination, which I'm sure Diana could tell us the wonders of and the inevitability of, do we have to start letting go of some of those notions of pure, hard non-discrimination in the retail side? Do we need to allow customers to differentiate themselves and express demand preferences that fall outside of the one-size-fits-all, here's your electron, it is X cents an hour?
Well, I think, if I can respond, to a certain extent you do. In the East, in particular, we're seeing huge amounts of resources being bid into centralized markets on the demand side. And really the worst form of a market is where you have supply side bidding but a completely inelastic demand curve. So in other words, the demand side doesn't get to play. They don't get to bid in their resources in a way that is complementary to suppliers bidding in their resources from the other side of the market. And if you think about market power issues, one of the major sources of discipline in the electric utility industry, where we have these jagged upward sloping supply curves, and if one plant goes down or is taken out of service as part of an anti-competitive strategy, prices can really spike. I mean, huge wealth transfers in very short periods of time in electricity markets. We've seen it in California. We've seen it in the East. I mean, this is the way these markets are built, and so we've had to respond. Regulators have had to respond. Antitrust enforcers have had to respond accordingly. So one major constraint on supply side mischief is to allow the demand side to bid in. But I think we see it happening in the East with big chunks of demand response being bid into the market. PJM has made great inroads doing that. The question is, well, how far can you take it down? Can you allow? Can I bid my resource into the market? Is the market set up, to account for bidding at that sort of micro level, atomistic level? Well, probably not. In fact, it probably would be inefficient to have those types of resources being bid in. I mean, just managing that auction infrastructure, building a market that could operate that way, and monitoring that market would be very, very difficult. So the question for policymakers is to figure out, how are we going to open up the demand side? To what extent are we going to recognize resources? How far down are we going to go in terms of recognizing little resources as opposed to bigger demand side resources? And of course, that will be need to be accompanied by regulatory oversight in terms of how utilities incorporate these resources in their portfolios.
Just if I
Yeah,
could, so
please.
Diana, doesn't that also then become a trade-off just on a kind of macroeconomic level? Because you can immerse yourself. I mean, we know that when you start to undertake one of these innovative approaches, it leads to different proceedings, and it can go on for years and years.
Absolutely.
And then you have at the end of that process some additional questions, maybe in management of load and other unintended consequences. So at some point, there's probably only so far you can go with that component, or you're starting to upset the balance again, and it's a little bit like the arcade game Whack-A-Mole, where you hit one and something else pops up, and now you've got another issue to deal with.
Right.
So
Right.
I think they're good drivers of behavior, and they're good indicators of and good incentives for the proper response.
Right.
But there's probably only so far you can go with that.
Right, and I'm not, very good point, and I'm not advocating for, allowing every, atomistic demand response resource to be bid into a market. You got to have a market anyway, but grappling with where you draw that line and how you get them integrated so that they're recognized as having an influence on the market by being bid into the market, that's a big question. I don't have the answer to that.
Well, let me ask a question of you, Chairman Appel. We don't have a wholesale market like PJM or MISO. If I aggregate demand or I have a distributed resource, how do you think of that in a vertically integrated context? Because in what FERC has done in Order 745, and I think the answer of 745 is it's too soon to tell if it's living up to its full potential, and maybe Tony can fill us in later tonight. But there's some exciting potential that I think a lot of people see, particularly on demand aggregation. How does that work in these square states where Order 745 has never been heard of?
Well, I can guarantee you Jim Tarpey has heard of it. I
Okay.
haven't. But let's go back to your previous question before we get to the answer, because I think your very first question really instructed us, which is, how do we look after ratepayers? And I think that's sort of first and foremost our concern as economic regulators is protecting ratepayers, then protecting, making sure we've got a vibrant utility, and how we go with distributed generation. As long as I keep talking about like aggressive incrementalism. How do we allow for some innovation there, but at the same time making sure that, as Carol talked about, there aren't these unintended consequences that we're doing a big shift. So I think
Right.
we take it gradually and look and say, how much could we do? Could we do 15 megawatts? Could we do 30 megawatts? Could we do 100 megawatts? And what do we learn from that before we take that next big step? But to me, it's going to have to be some type of gradual approach, allow for some innovation, but at the same time, never take, you asked me that, which I think is the most fundamental question, is how can you regulate with an imbalance of information a utility? Frankly, we can't. But what we can do is hew to really fundamental values of making sure we're looking after the ratepayers and making sure we're paying attention to those fundamentals so things don't get so far ahead of us that, we've Clean Air, Clean Jobs said we're going to address 50% of the coal generation, substitute natural gas, or have conversion depending on the economics, but it wasn't 100%. And there was some wisdom in having that balance and allowing numerous parties to come in and talk about where is that sweet spot. I think so long as we keep doing it in a manageable block and don't do something precipitous, we can keep doing that, but we always have to keep our eyes on the ball of what's this going to do to other ratepayers. Certain people have more flexibility than others do, and allow that innovation in a sector, but we just have to pay attention to that really fundamental, what really is put in the statute. We have a job to go with least cost looking after consumers. At the same time, now I'm taking a little beyond your question, we have a contrary statute which says least cost is not always the option. It's promoting the innovation.
And if I might, I think to your point, Chairman, it also is going to vary very much on the geographic location.
Yeah.
What are the transmission capabilities in the area?
Right.
As I said earlier, what is the mix? If you have a lot of coal in your state and a lot of intermittent power, you're going to have to look at flexible power options in a different way. In California, there's other overlays. You've got AB 32, and now you've got a whole regime of greenhouse reduction proceedings and discussions to take place that are going to affect the regulators' job when they come and say how much should we innovate and how much should we just have a traditional model.
Let me, advertise to the audience. We're going to take questions in a moment before I ask my final question. As per tradition, students will have first priority to ask questions, and if no student asks questions, I am free to call on them. So let me ask a final question, which is probably appropriate given we're in Boulder, and Chairman Appel, if you want to demur, I'll give you that right. We've been talking largely about business models of investor-owned utilities. We haven't really touched on municipally owned utilities and co-ops, which serve vast territories, rural parts of America, and municipal utilities here in Colorado. Fort Collins, Longmont, Colorado Springs are all municipal and self-regulating after a fashion. Are those municipal business models, how do they relate to innovation? You've certainly seen more smart grid investment by those sorts of utilities. And you then also just have a vast mismatch, if you look across nationally, as to what their rate structures look like. You can't kind of a priori say they're always cheaper or always more expensive. What do you think of those other models, and how do they fit into this scheme where you don't have the regulatory incentive problems, or different regulatory incentive problems would be accurate, I suppose, that investor-owned utilities and public utilities commissions have?
Well, I think my two fellow panelists have much greater insights than I do, so I'll do yours.
I'll take it. I've had the good fortune to work with both municipal utilities and co-ops in Colorado and in California and a few other places. And I would say that not as many, more similarities than you would expect, and more following and a kind of converging of the same innovation and the same models, much more so than you would expect. I mean, here in the state, for Colorado Springs, they were involved in a solar project down at the Air Force Academy. It was actually really a public-private partnership project more than anything. It involved a private developer. It involved some ARA money. It involved a federal installation. But it also had some options and features of it that would actually allow municipal ownership of a renewable facility. And we've seen that in California. I think that it's a more indirect effect, but the policies that are set, Chairman, at the commission level, whether it's a state or federal commission, even if they don't technically apply, and in some cases there's legislation that does make them apply, but there's an enormous amount of pressure to kind of conform to that policy. So you have an increasing amount of renewable content in munis and co-ops, even if they don't strictly have to, and in some cases they're ahead of the game. Or you have buying and selling of projects, which you normally would think, first you'd think private sector, then you'd think IOUs. Maybe last on the list you'd think munis. So you do have some of that. And then ultimately they're really not exempt from some of the concerns. For example, we were talking earlier about LADWP, and for a while they were enjoying the kind of safety bubble of not having rate increases. But a good reason for that is that a lot of the power was coming in from coal, and coal from out of state. So what they were looking at 10 years down the road was potentially carbon taxes, something that would apply to them especially if they didn't start to change the generation mix and kind of conform to where the rest of it was going. So that's perhaps a longer answer, but
yeah, just certainly on the issue, but sort of in a different flavor. If I work a lot with American Public Power Association and NRECA, and their interests are their members. Obviously, their interests are in delivering low-cost, high-quality power to their members. What we deal a lot with are issues that pop up in these very large centralized markets, particularly in the East, PJM, New England, New York. And there's a case pending right now before FERC. It's a request for rehearing by APPA on behalf of the New York Power Authority, where essentially they entered into a long-term power purchase agreement with a refurbished generation unit, very state-of-the-art, refurbished, very, very environmentally friendly. And lo and behold, the New York ISO claimed that this unit was to be exempt from market mitigation rules. Well, without boring you with the technical details, the upshot of that is that the unit basically gets kicked out of the market and will raise costs not only to the municipal who's purchasing the power under that long-term power purchase agreement, but potentially to all the ratepayers in the New York markets. So the lesson here, the point I want to make is that municipals are trying very hard to be innovative, not only at the micro level, but in how they contract and the types of resources that they contract for, only to be held hostage in many cases by market rules in some of these very large centralized markets. Well, if you want to send a bad signal to a market participant who is pursuing what they consider to be an efficient, innovative strategy, that's a really good way to do it.
Right. Questions, quickly, students? Yes, back there. Steve, we got a microphone.
Would a real-time pricing signal promote efficiency and protect profits in a way that, and if so, why haven't we ever seen that in a retail market?
Real-time pricing. Why haven't we seen it, and would it be efficient?
Well, I don't have a chalkboard, so I won't draw you a graph. You don't want to see that anyway.
That's when people nod off right away.
Right.
Economists draw demand.
The answer is yes. In most circumstances, real-time pricing does extract huge efficiencies for both sides of the market. The reason why we don't see more of it, the old reason was that utilities didn't want to invest in the technology that gave consumers the ability to respond to a signal. There are some complicating factors associated with state-level regulation and the whole sort of political atmosphere in the state behind these more innovative strategies. So I would say there are sort of political, institutional, regulatory obstacles that have slowed that whole process down, but the gains are potentially huge.
Mr. Chairman, let me ask you pointedly, if a utility came to you with a real-time pricing program, how would you weigh it? When
Right.
a great expert like Diana Moss comes and testifies in front of you about the efficiency gains that the market will see.
And I'd say, how does this benefit the ratepayers? I mean, is this going to really allow us to shut down coal-fired units? Is it going to allow us to?
Capacity.
What is it going to do for us? I mean, it's economic theory. It's tremendous, but what does it do ultimately to the ratepayers? Would
Right.
be my question.
And the chairman raises a good point, and that is that there are obviously, this is not we do not operate in a vacuum here. There are transactions costs, there are surge costs. I mean, there's lots of fiddling around that needs to be done to put these programs into place. But, in theory, as you point out, it all looks really good.
Let's have one last question. Yes.
So my question is, what's the outlook for the power? Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my question is, what's the outlook for the power purchasing agreement for renewable energy in the context of the natural gas boom? So I know because of vertical integration of Colorado's policy, we have done very good on this part, but I just want to know what are the future trend of that.
What does well, I think there are a few questions kind of to tease out of there, but what does the natural gas boom mean for renewables, and what does the future look like for renewables, both in Colorado and around the country? Carl, you're
Sure, yeah.
close to
Happy
the capital side of this.
Happy to take that. Different effects on the renewable industry. I mean, long term, if the prices against which renewables are compared are driven by natural gas models, then that puts a lot of pressure on the economics. I think most folks believe that in the long run that natural gas prices, despite abundant supply, will start to come up. There's the other kind of somewhat negative factor is that as the programs have worked, and so now there are quite a bit more renewable in the mix. Certainly here in the state and in California. So as that fills up, then there's less inclination to have some of the incentives. But still, the prices on the cost side, the prices of renewable power are coming down. I think that some still need incentives. Obviously, you have the kind of little bit of the boom and bust on the wind with PTC, but I think it'll have a place. I think it has a bright future. I think it has to be in the mix. I think there's plenty of markets that are not quite saturated where you have to have that. Some of the trick will be integration and how that can be integrated with the rest of the generation mix in a manner that the utilities can actually manage the load properly.
Joshua?
I agree with Carl completely. I think one of the big issues is what's the time horizon that you're looking at? Because if we just look at 1 year or 2 years, of course, gas is going to dominate. We had this issue before us. We've already decided, so we could discuss it, but we had a 200 megawatt project, which is actually going online soon, presented to us as a hedge against gas prices. And if you looked at the forecast price, 1 or 2 years, maybe 3 or 4 years, you could not approve it. But when you say there's going to be, at some point, an increase in gas prices as a hedge, it makes a lot of sense. And having that whole mix, having a better balanced portfolio, that was, to me, the determining factor. So you'd really have to always ask yourself, am I in this for 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, or 40 years? And finding that right kind of balance.
And I think in this industry, it's better to look somewhere in the middle.
Right.
Not 1 to 2 or 3 years, but 5 to 10 years out.
Yeah.
Damn those long-lived assets. I want to thank our panelists, Carl, Diana, Chairman Appel. I want to thank you. We do not have a break, so Professor Boyd is going to roll right through. And this is pretty good for Silicon Flatirons to be within 5 minutes after the first panel.
Good to see you.
Great job.